I'm not ashamed to own my Lord, nor to defend his cause. Maintain the honors of his word, the glory of his cross.
We're at Colossians chapter 4. This is our final week. Lord willing, it'll be our final week. We've got about 35 minutes, so we'll see if we can get through names. We've been talking about Paul's final greetings and exhortations. Let's read verses 7 to 18. Again, we'll do 3 verses each. And we're down to verse 14 before we start, but I'd like to get a little bit of the context. Naomi, you can start 3 verses each. Starting at verse 7.
Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you, with Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, about whom you received instructions. If he comes to you, welcome him. And Jesus, who is called Justice. These are my only fellow workers for the kingdom of God, who are of the circumcision. They have proved to be a comfort to me. Epaphras, who is one of you, a bondservant of Christ, greets you, always laboring fervently for you in prayers, that you may stand perfect and complete in all the will of God.
For I bear him witness that he has a great zeal for you, and those who are in Laodicea, and those in Hierapolis. Luke, the beloved physician, and Demas greet you. Greet the brethren who are in Laodicea, and Nymphas, and the church that is in his house.
And after you have read this letter, have it read at the church in Laodicea. In turn, read the letter from Laodicea as well. And tell Archippus, see that you complete the ministry you received in the Lord. I, Paul, write this greeting by my own hand. Remember my chains. Grace be with you. We could have easily gone through each of these names like a lot of people go through the names. Read them, have trouble pronouncing them, move on. And without realizing it, sometimes at the end of those books, we don't know much more about the people than what is told to us. But when we skip the names, we do run over the fact that they were being listed for a reason. When you skip Romans 16, the names that are there, you miss a key point about women having a role in the ministry of Paul. I was writing the podcast this afternoon for Luke chapter, I think it's 7 or 8. I forget which chapter it is. But Luke begins the chapter there by listing a group of women. And why did he do that? Because he was trying to show that they had a part in Jesus' ministry too. They weren't the 12 apostles, but they did have a part and a role to play. And so when we come along and think women, because they cannot preach, because they do not lead the assembly of the church, that therefore they have no role, is a complete misinterpretation of what Scripture says. And when we skip names like that, because we read a lot about Paul and Timothy and Titus and Peter, these are all men, we can lose sight of the fact that women have a role too, and an important one at that. We'll get to Nympha or Nymphas a little bit later, because it depends on which version you have as to whether that's a man or a woman. Bill's version was a man, this version's a woman. And but that's neither here nor there. We read the names because they're important. Paul put them there. We should take the time. Last week we discussed Tychicus, who was a faithful minister. We discussed Onesimus, who is that runaway slave from Philemon, who's now a Christian. We talked about Aristarchus, who was from Thessalonica and a prisoner with Paul. We discussed John Mark, who we found out here was the cousin or relative of Barnabas. We didn't know that from the book of Acts. We do know that here. We know that Mark was the writer of the book of Mark, and he was an associate, or not associate, a close companion of Peter, and later would become a close companion of Paul. And then we finished with Epaphras in verse 12. Oh, why? This thing keeps falling off my nose. But I have a broken nose. I should know why. Epaphras is one of the Colossians and a slave of Christ. That's, I think, where we finished. Which brings us down. I should have said we should have started at verse 13, but to question 6, though. Where is Hierapolis, and how close is it to Laodicea and Colossae? Unless you have a map in your head of Asia Minor and just know geography that well. That was a hard question, but remember this book had a map at the beginning. If you are watching on looking for what is Turkey today, the western section of Turkey. So if you find the boot of Italy, move east. You'll first come to Greece, continue moving east, and the next big landmass over the Aegean Sea is what we would call Turkey today. And it will be there that you're looking for Hierapolis. Where is it? For those who have the map here. Northeast of Laodicea. In reference to Colossae, where is it? A little bit northwest.
Further north though than Colossae.
Yeah, so we have 3 cities. We have Hierapolis, north. The middle is Laodicea. And then the most southern one is Colossae. And I compared it to, even though these would be east-west mostly for us, Mississauga, Toronto, and Pickering. Those are the 3. If you travel the Gardiner Expressway, well, if you travel the 401, you can stay on the same highway. Travel the 401, when you pass the airport, you're in Mississauga. Just as you pass the airport, you come to Toronto, and you have to travel a ways, but the first city you come to after you leave Toronto is Pickering. And so I think in our let's see if he gave us I don't think he gave us a distance, but they're not that far. They're neighboring cities at that time. You could do those walks probably in a short period of time. We're not talking that it's a day trip, but it's not weeks. And people went between those 3 cities. Those are trading cities. And in fact, if I remember right, there's aqueducts that connect those 3 cities. And I forget which way it runs, but either it's Hierapolis or Colossae. It starts with cool water, and as it runs through Laodicea, start with cold. We'll say it runs north to south. If it's cold water in Hierapolis, when it gets to Laodicea, what temperature would you say it was? Pardon me? It would be warm, but would it be hot? Not really. Be lukewarm. What do we remember about the church at Laodicea? It was lukewarm in the book of Revelation. And a lot of people think that there is the reason that word was chosen. Not only did it describe the church, but the people of Laodicea would understand what that meant. Because as you start with cold water, it's going to warm up as it goes, and eventually it will be hot water. But getting back to our question, Hierapolis, Colossae, and Laodicea were neighboring cities, and Laodicea and Colossae are pretty close. What was to be done? I guess that was... Nope, he didn't ask that. No, it is question 8. I will skip that then. So we need to remember the geography. These are 3 neighboring cities. How is Luke described in this passage? He's a beloved physician, which makes him a what? What profession?
Doctor.
A doctor. He'd be a pretty busy person today. And he'd be an educated person. There were some doctors at that time that were just what we might call the person who people went to. They called themselves a doctor, but that doesn't mean they were a doctor. From all accounts we have is Luke is a doctor. And him being a physician might have been a great help to Paul, besides the fact that he was a Christian and a knowledgeable man at that. We know that Luke is... What books did Luke write? Luke and Acts. And so he is an inspired writer of the New Testament. And so he's with Paul coming here. In verse Luke, the beloved physician, and Demas. He didn't have a question about Demas. What do we know about Demas? He fell away. But does it say that he fell away here? So, that gives us a time period. Demas is here. Luke, the beloved physician, and Demas greet you. So we understand at this point that Demas is a Christian, a faithful Christian. If we go to 2 Timothy chapter 4, we read of something else. Naomi, you get for 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 10. Yeah, you can do. And then Dalmatia, and verse 11 would say, only Luke is with me. Yeah. Demas has forsaken Paul. Paul here is in prison again at the end of 2 Timothy. However, we know that's a different imprisonment. It's a second one. And during that time period, we're probably talking a couple years, Demas loved this present world. If you were talking about the parable of the sower, what type of ground would he be? Wayside, rocky, thorny, or good ground? Which one loves this present world? Can you answer that?
Door.
I thought this was a fire alarm.
It's 6, Naomi. They hung up. That's my doorbell.
I couldn't have that as a doorbell.
That's why it is my doorbell. You can keep that there. Make sure the app's still open for the bell to ring, though. Oh, it's always great when you don't turn your phone on, and that's even better when they dial the wrong number. But,
Like, he took Ruth because he was with him. I can't remember which ground that was, but he took root, but then he fell away.
Yeah, it's thorny ground.
Thorny, there you go.
There we go. Before we were interrupted, I was trying to figure out what are you talking about.
Answer
Yeah.
your question.
It'd be thorny ground. He took root. He would have been fruitful for a time, but then became unfruitful. And of course, if we're unfruitful, Christ is going to cast us away. Demas in Colossians was following Christ, but in 2 Timothy he was not. So these are the names, the first set of names. Then Paul tells them, all right, give greetings to the brothers and sisters who are in Laodicea. That tells me that they're close. You don't have to travel that far. Why would you tell someone to greet someone who you're never going to see? So these congregations were probably a little close too. Probably had friends in both. And to Nympha and the church that meets in her house, why might you think that there is disagreement as to who this person, whether this was a man or a woman? Think about English names.
Sorry, I was still stuck on Demas.
Okay.
I was just reading and it said that having loved this present world didn't necessarily mean that he fell away from the church. He just wasn't, he didn't want to die.
Yes. All right, we can go back to that.
Paul at that time.
We could go back to that. That certainly is a possibility.
Yeah, it's another.
It is a possibility. As you can read that. I've always wondered about that, because when it comes along and talks about Titus and Crescens in the same verse, you could sort of say, okay, is he saying Demas left me, and then these other two, they left me, but it wasn't the same situation as Demas? I've always wondered on that verse, and I'd have to sit down and really think about it a little bit more. Loving this present world, though, isn't, regardless of whether or not he totally fell away, he's not getting a rave review from Paul. Loving this present world, at the very least, is going to lead to that if you don't correct that. And so, yes, I can see the point, and that's a good point that you raised, that perhaps Demas didn't fall away. I sort of wonder you have notes there, right?
Yeah.
I would like to know who wrote that, because if there is a Calvinistic slant on that, that would be the reason they take that slant.
But I was just looking at Barnes there.
Yeah, Barnes will be Calvinistic. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm not saying Barnes is necessarily wrong. But when you have a Calvinistic point of view, well, they don't believe you can lose your salvation. So I was listening to John MacArthur this morning before I picked up Naomi, trying to explain how falling from grace doesn't really mean falling from grace. And in Galatians chapter 5, and I'm sitting here going, he was saying it was referring to non-Christians. And I said, that's funny, because the book of Galatians was written to Christians. I marvel that you are so soon removed from the gospel which I preached to you, which is not another but a perversion. And so that is a possibility. I'm not saying Barnes is wrong, Barnes is right, but I do watch out for a Calvinistic tinge, because they have to interpret that verse that way. But it is a possibility, I will admit that. So at the very least, Demas is not getting a raving review from Paul and needed to correct something, because loving this present world is not something that we can do. Let's go back to question 8. What were the Colossians to do with the letter that Paul sent them? And have them do what?
Read it there.
And what were they to do with something that they received from Laodicea?
They were read what they received from Laodicea also.
Okay. This is a significant point that we can run over something really quickly and miss maybe something Paul is saying. Who was this letter written to? The one that we're studying.
Colossians.
All right. Now you would think, okay, if Tammy gets a letter from somebody, it's written to Tammy. That doesn't necessarily mean the letter is also to be read by Bill or to be read by somebody else. Sometimes a person, though, might say at the bottom, please share this with so-and-so. They just write you because they don't want to write the letter to like 6-8 different people. It's just so much more convenient. Write it to someone and have them share it. Well, when it comes to the Bible, are any of the books of the Bible written to us? To us personally? Yeah. It's sort of a double-edged question. You could say yes and no. The letters to the Corinthians was originally written to the church at Corinth. Now, why can we take a look at their letter and say that we can take Paul's message there and apply it to the church at East End? They're all Christians. It's the same church, as far as not the same locality, not the same congregation, but the lessons that Paul is teaching are universal lessons. The issues that the church at Corinth faced are problems that all churches can face and all churches have to deal with. The letter to the Colossians. This idea of being deceived by philosophy and needing to remember that they're saved by Christ and how to be the Christian God wants you to be. Those are all things that, first of all, if the church of Colossae was going through it, because Laodicea was so close, the congregation at Laodicea probably were going through the same things as the church at Colossae. It's like if false doctrine comes to Canada and it comes to East End, probably it's also coming to West End because we talk to each other. And so if we had an apostle today write us a letter and say, oh, by the way, share it with that church too because they're going to face the same things, we would recognize, okay, congregations that are close deal with the same problems, but Christians as a whole all deal with the same problems. How to be a Christian, how to remain a Christian, how are we saved, what is the relationship with Christ in the Godhead. All of these things are universal lessons. We don't have to recognize, okay, we're not the church of Colossae, therefore this is not for us. There might be a specific issue, like in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. We didn't write Paul asking about marriage and meats offered to idols and other things. We can learn those lessons about them, but we didn't write Paul about those things. Those were unique to the church at Corinth, even though we can learn lessons from them. But the point I want to make is, the letters we read of in the Bible, even though they're not specifically directed to us, teach universal lessons that we can learn from. And so by seeing that this practice existed even in the first century, shows us where we got the Bible from. Did the Catholics give us the Bible? No, they did not. The churches shared the letters among each other. Paul would have written a letter to Colossae, but I can almost guarantee you The church at Hierapolis saw the letter. We know the church at Laodicea should have seen the letter. And any other church that those Christians went to, they were copying out the letters. We have a lot of copies of the New Testament books. We don't maybe have a complete Bible, although we have something pretty close. But all we have bits and pieces of, might have this letter, might have this set of letters, and we have numerous copies of them. And these copies predate the so-called canonization of the New Testament. The Catholics didn't give us the Bible. The Bible existed before. And the way it existed was exactly how the letters were transmitted here. If the letter to the Colossians remained in Colossae, we wouldn't have it today. It had to be shared. And it was to this church. Anything else before we move to the next one? Question 9 asks, what were the brethren to tell Archippus?
Take heed to the responsibility that he had
And what did he have?
in teaching that he received from the Lord.
Sure.
And then the sentence.
Sure. We might have said, some versions would tell us, to complete the ministry you've received, take heed, be careful of the ministry which you have received in the Lord, that you may fulfill it. The Lord had given him a task. He probably was a preacher. Probably. The way the language is. And just like Paul told Timothy, preach the word, be instant in season, out of season, reprove, rebuke, exhort with all long suffering, do the work of an evangelist. Just because someone is an evangelist doesn't mean that they automatically do everything that they're supposed to do, or do it well. Archippus had a job to do. It does not mean that he was necessarily bad at what he did, but he needed to be encouraged to keep on going, to fulfill it, to make sure that you do it to the best that you can. If he was at Colossae, and it makes it seem like he is, there were problems at Colossae. They were being drawn away by doctrines of philosophy. Well, how sometimes does false doctrine creep into the church? Sometimes, not all the time. Through the preacher sometimes. And if the preacher, it may not come in through the preacher, but a lot of the times it does. And we've elevated preachers to a point that they should not be. But the preacher is the most visible person usually in the congregation, at least when it comes to the worship service. He's presenting the lesson more often than not. But in a congregation without elders, and we don't know if Colossae had elders or not, in a congregation without elders, if the preacher doesn't bring in false doctrine, but somebody else does, what should the preacher be trying to help do? Refute it. Remember, reprove, rebuke, exhort with all long suffering. If Archippus was the reason that the Colossians were facing trouble, that needed to be corrected. However, if he wasn't doing everything he needed to do, if others were bringing in this doctrine and he wasn't standing up to it, he wasn't doing his work. He was allowing false doctrine to seep in. And yes, it's not completely the preacher's responsibility to make sure everyone is following Christ completely. But it's certainly his responsibility to teach on those topics. To let the congregation know this is what's right. If the congregation doesn't follow it, it's not necessarily the preacher's fault. The preacher has to do his job. Archippus had a job to do, a ministry to do. He needed to fulfill it. He needed to see it through to the end. Do you have something?
No.
Okay.
No,
Looked like you
no.
did. Well, it's harder to see facial expressions when you have a mask on.
Yeah.
And I'm sure it's hard for you to think about what's he saying. I'm finding it difficult to... I'll tell you something afterwards about something I saw on television, but it is a mask. When you have facial expressions, we are a very visual, body language sort of people, and when you cover your face, it's harder to joke, to be sarcastic, and to know, okay, is someone following me or not? So I'm glad you're following me. Question 10. What were the brethren to remember about Paul?
Well, it says remember his chains, so they should be in the position of putting themselves in that position, as if they were in chains.
Okay, why would you say that? I think that's a good answer, but
Well, it helps us understand maybe more of what the other person's going through. Helps us maybe more compassion or move us to try harder.
yeah. Think about it this way. The Colossians were free, relatively speaking. They didn't have the government keeping them in jail. He had just told Archippus to take heed to the ministry that's given to you. Do the work that you've been given to do. Paul has limited opportunities because he's in chains. The entire chapter, pray the doors of opportunity be open to you. That's what we're doing. Now you remember me too. Remember that I'm in jail. I don't want to be here. So why don't you earnestly pray for me too? Sympathize with me. Understand my situation. Pray that you don't come into the same situation, but pray for my situation too. I'm praying for you and other people are praying for you. If you pray for me, perhaps my situation will change too. Remember, the fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much. If we pray for something that we need, well, God may say yes or no. But the more people that pray for that, maybe, the more likely it will happen. Not guaranteed, but can't do any harm for certain. So, Paul wants to be remembered. He's been remembering them, looking out for them, and he would like them to do the same.
The thoughts in under like speaking of brotherly love in Hebrews.
Yeah.
The writer of Hebrews said, "Remember the prisoners as if chained with them."
Yeah.
And then remember like the ones mistreated.
So in case people couldn't hear you, which verse was that?
3.
Hebrews 3 and...
Hebrews 13 and 3.
Oh, sorry. Hebrews 13 and 3. Yeah, that's a good point about remembering others who are in chains. I'm going to read that so that people online can hear it. Hebrews 13 verse 3 said, "Remember the prisoners as if chained with them, those who are mistreated, since you yourselves are also in the body." we can sometimes get disconnected from each other because, well, COVID, we've been separated from one another for 3-4 months. But with brethren around the world who we might have never met, we don't have that connection. But we're all members of the same body. Brethren in Brazil, if you take a look at the numbers in the U.S., the numbers in Brazil are much worse. And brethren in Brazil, some of them my relatives, have been dealing not with maybe personally themselves, but their relatives have been. And members of the church in Brazil have been. A lot of COVID cases in Brazil are a result of poverty and a lack of healthcare system and someone who wants to be Donald Trump light. But we have a bad situation in Brazil, terrible. Brethren in India, same thing. And increasingly so in the United States. But we don't know those brethren, so we don't relate to them. We should be praying for them because they're part of the same body we are. Well, Paul was part of the same body as the Colossians, not a member of their local congregation, but they were all Christians. So even if you don't know somebody, let's pray for those who we know need prayed for. So that's the book of Colossians. The book of Colossians, short book. It took us 24 class weeks to do it, although there were many weeks in there that we did not meet, and we probably did about half this class at my place without doing the questions. But it is a book that reminds us about Jesus Christ. It's focused on Christ, His preeminence, His role in our salvation, and who we should look to in order to be the Christians that we ought to be. To look to Christ, to put on Christ, to put on all of those attributes that we talked about in chapter 3, was looking above, not here on this earth. And so Colossians, all of the New Testament is centered on Christ. But Colossians is very much so. It's its main focus, understanding that Jesus is everything, and that without Him we would be nothing. And so why would we want to give that up to follow after some other doctrine from this world? And so I know we didn't do a full review, but you do have your class books. We are going to be taking, I'm only going to be taking my book, which is this one. We're going to be starting, the Lord willing, in 2 weeks, a study of 3 books, one at a time. A study of the epistles of John, which are 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. Now, this book is written by Gene Taylor. Its copyright date is 1994. We have permission to photocopy it. Gene Taylor is not, he has questions in there too, but his style of teaching is we go through the outline and then we answer questions at the end. Now, as Bill knows from our men's class books, he doesn't give much space for writing questions. However, I decided, in order to give Bill more space, not to double-side the pages. And so that gives people the chance to write on the back of the pages, and if they want to write some longer answers or take some notes. So there should be plenty of space to write.